So in the last session, we actually went through the process of recording a transaction either as an income or as an expense. We also went through the process of making sure that we actually reduced the budget or the wallet balance if a transaction has been recorded as either as an income when it has been recorded as an expense, and increment the wallet balance when it has been recorded as a as an expense. So what we are going to do in this session now is we are going to move forward to the reversal. So let's assume that you've recorded a transaction as income and you no longer want to record it as an income, or maybe you've recorded a transaction as expense, you no longer want to record it as an expense. So basically just reversing uh, um, your previous action. We could have said that we should allow users to actually update the amount and all directly, but that would be counterintuitive. Usually in finance, that is something that is not actually encouraged. So that's why we are using reversal as a way of reversing previously done transactions. So to start with, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the transaction service. And I'm going to create a method for our transaction um, reversal. So I'm just going to copy all of this method right here. And I'm going to paste. So I'll call this reverse. So we don't need a payload here actually. All we need is just the transaction that we actually want to perform reversal on. So I'm going to say transaction, then models.transaction. So I'm going to remove all of this. So to start with, the first thing I want to initiate is I want to actually, just like we did for this guy right here. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm basically going to initiate a transaction date and description. So I'll say transaction date. That will be time dot now. That is when the transaction was reversed. And I'm going to also have a description. I'm going to call it I'm going to call it reversed transaction. And I'm going to generate a transaction request. Request that's store transaction request, because basically a reversal is just another transaction but reversing the transaction that we performed earlier. So for that, I'm going to have the wallet ID we want to perform the transaction on. I'm also going to have the amount that we want to reverse. The date will be the transaction date that we've created, and we are going to format using our date only. Let me just say, I don't think we need to format it. So just transaction is fine. Why? Okay, this is a string, so format. That's why we need to format it. So let me say time dot date only. Then the next thing we need to do is pass the description, then the parent ID. So that's where that parent ID we created actually comes into play. That is the transaction we are reversing. So that would be the transaction ID. it like so. So now that we have that out of the way, the first thing I want to do is I want to initialize a transaction. So what I'm going to do is error to be db dot transaction, and I'm going to return nil. So the first thing I want to do is if the transaction type, let me just go to our transaction handler. Let me copy those guys. So if the transaction type is of this, expense is of type income. So I need a wallet service. I need the wallet service. So I'm going to initiate the wallet service right here, wallet service, and that will be the current transaction TX, right? What are we doing here? Okay, I don't need, okay, let's just leave it like so. So we are passing the current transaction. And if it is, so since it is a reversal, if the transaction type is income, right, we want to reset the transaction request type to expense, right? That's the first thing we want to do. And since it was recorded as an income, we have to do the opposite, which is basically this. And for this, we want to perform this. So basically, we want to send the transaction to wallet and the transaction dot amount, right? Or transaction request, since we've already initiated it. Transaction request dot amount. So if it is an expense, we want to set the transaction request to income. That is, the transaction we want to reverse is type expense. We want to reverse it to income. Then we want to set the transaction dot wallet, and we want to send the transaction request dot amount, right? So what we are going to say here is, let's just say transaction could not be reversed. Try again later. So I'm just going to return the same thing right here. So if all goes well, what we want to do now is actually create a transaction. So we'll now say error. That will be cs dot create a transaction. And as we've done, that's why we've actually generated this request so that we can reuse that method. And we are like that. We are also going to pass the transaction dot user ID. Create method transaction user ID is reversal now will be true. And like so, transaction dot date. So if all goes well during the process of creating the transaction, if all does not go well, we just return the same error. Otherwise, we are good. So now the next thing is if error is nil, we want to return, is not nil, we want to return the error. But this time around, we are not returning the transaction model. And we want to return the error. Otherwise, we want to return nil. Okay, now that we've actually completed our transaction, our reverse transaction method, the next thing we are going to move to now is the process of creating an handler to actually call the transaction reverse method itself. So for this, it is going to be a patch request that we are going to. So let me start by actually creating a route for the reverse transaction implementation. So I will just call this reverse, and I will be accepting the ID of the transaction. So this will be reverse transaction. Yes. So our reverse transaction method is going to be like every other method that we've created before now that makes use of a parameter. So the first thing we need is the ID of type ID param. Then the next thing is we need to get the currently authenticated user. Oh, sorry, this method should be in the handler, transaction handler. So let's get the authenticated user. Right. Then let's bind. So let's look at an handler that we've used ID. Yeah. So this is what I need. So the next thing is we need to bind the path param. So this is our path param. So this will be transaction ID. I'll pass the transaction ID here. So once we bind this path param, any ID that we supplied in the path will actually have the value. With the transaction ID, we carry that value. Now, once we do that, the next thing we need to do is to actually filter and get the transaction. So I'm going to create a query scope. I'm going to create, so the next thing we actually need to do is to actually get the transaction. So how do we retrieve the transaction? We need a transaction service, and the transaction service, what I'm going to do is I'm going to initialize it with a scope. Should we? Yes, let's initialize it with a scope, and we say scopes, right? Or is it common dot where user ID scope, and that will be the user dot ID. So this way, any query we actually perform with this transaction service, we have the where user ID scope applied to it. So now we need to actually get the transaction, and an error will be returned. So our transaction service dot let's say find by ID by ID. I'll pass the transaction ID dot ID to it. Then we return nil. If an error occurs, we return an error. So I'm going to create this method. Yes. So this will either be a pointer to model dot transaction model or an error type. So for this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to declare a val.transaction model, and I'm going to get the results of the transaction db.first transaction that actually satisfies this this query. So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to use this method. I'm going to use where, or let me do some joins dot the wallets that are the wallet that is related to the transaction. I also want to perform a join that joins the category that is associated to the transaction. Then we perform a where on the ID of the transaction and updates the transaction as well. So now that we've done that, now that we've retrieved, we will check if there is an error. So if there is an error, that is the result of error is non-nil, we want to return it. Otherwise, we want to return nil. We want to return the transaction and nil. So if we come back to our transaction handler, we can see that we have our transaction now. So if the transaction is not found, we want to return an error. We want to return, that is, if the error is nil. If the error is not nil, we want to return an error. Then otherwise, let me do something. fmt.println transaction. Right. So let me just return nil. So I want to test this URL. And I will come to the Postman, come to reverse transaction. So I want to put in a transaction ID that does not exist. So we can see we are getting not found. So let's see what the error is. Okay, it seems it's a route issue. /API/transactions/reverse. So let's check the routes. Reverse. Oh, it's a post method. So let's make it let's leave it as a post. Let's use a get method. And I'm going to change this to get. I'm going to refresh. Or should it be a get method? Let's make it a post method or a patch method. Let's make it a patch method. Then let's rerun. Let's update this to patch. Now, so we can see we are getting column ID in where clause is ambiguous. So let's see what is going on there. Transaction service find by ID. So we are okay. So instead of this where, let's just use first. I don't think we need to where, just first. Then the first we pass in the ID that we want to query by. Yeah. So let's refresh the application. Yes. So we are getting user ID, column user ID in where clause is ambiguous. So what we can do is, so the reason why we are getting that error is because on the wallet table, we have the user ID column, and on the transaction ID, if we check let me just show us. So if we check, you will see that on the wallet table, we have the user ID, and on the users and on the transactions table, transactions, let's refresh. Yeah. On the transactions table, we also have the user ID. So that's the issue that we are having. So let's see how we can actually resolve this. One way to resolve this is to probably remove the join wallet, right? But let's see if there is a better way that we can actually resolve this. So in order to resolve this, what we can do is we can ignore the scopes, right? Or we can adjust our scope to actually accept an extra value, maybe like the table name we want to actually apply the user ID scope on, right? So but that would need us to actually update. Okay, let me just create another method. User ID scope with table name. So this will accept the user ID and it will accept table name, which should be a string, right? So we can say that will be table name dots. That will be dots. Let me put the dots there, and this will be a plus, right? Yeah. So that will be table name. So this will be something like select more like let's say the table name is wallets. So that will be wallet dots user ID, right? So that will make our life much easier. So what we are going to do now is we are going to copy the scope and come to transaction scope here and supply the table name we want to use. So the table name that I want to use here is transactions. Correct. So I will come back here, then remove the scope. Now let's refresh our application. If we hit the API now, so now you can see we are getting record not found, which is perfect. So one thing I want to do is I actually want to know when the type of error being returned is really of type record not found, right? So what I'm going to do for this is I'm going to say that if result is of type record not found like this, we want to return transaction not found. Otherwise, we just return the error, right? And I think we created a method for returning this kind of record not found. So what we are going to do is we are going to state that let me look at our errors. I believe we've done something like here, not found. Yeah, this right here. Let's look at places where we've used it. Yeah, so this is how we use it, right? Let's come to transaction service. Then we say transaction not found, transaction not found. Then let's see how we checked. Yeah, so like this, go back to the transaction handler. Then we do this. So if it is type of the new error record not found that we sent, then we want to send not found. Otherwise, we want to send, let's say, an internal server error occurred. Send internal server error occurred. So now that we've done that, let's try to refresh our application and see if we are going to get what we sent. Yeah, you can see we are getting transaction not found. So which is perfect. So let's come back to our code editor. So now if we are able to find our transaction, then that means we can go ahead to actually update the reverse. We can go ahead to reverse the transaction, I mean. So error. So as you can see, reverse transaction. So if the error is nil, is not nil, we want to like, let me see what kind of method. Okay, transaction could not be reversed. Okay. So we can say that, let's just log. I'm going to print, or inside this, I will log in the errors. So what I'm going to do is each of these instances, I'm going to print the actual errors that occurred. here too, I'm going to print the actual error. I'm going to print the actual error. So in the transaction handler, if an error occurs, I just want to say return common dot send internal server error, the context and the error that we actually returned. Then otherwise we send return dot common dot send success, transaction reversed, then the transaction that was reversed. Or we don't even to send anything. It's just new since it's just a reversed transaction. So let's try to refresh our application and try to reverse a transaction that actually exists. So let's see a transaction that actually exists. Transactions, transaction ID. So we have 14, 15, 16. So this is 17. So let's reverse the transaction ID of 17. So we are getting an error, transaction could not be reversed, try again later. So what's the error? Unknown column, balance field, update transactions. So unknown column, set balance, okay. So after further debugging, I realized that we needed to actually create a different query rather than having the user scope directly on this query right here. We needed a different query for the querying of the transaction that we actually want to find. So what I did was using the transaction, the DB instance here to get the transaction, right? So after using it to get the transaction, I was able to actually get the transaction itself. So that way, by the time we come into the transaction service, we don't still have that user scope on the DB instance itself. So make sure that you update your code to this line. Then so inside the transaction, once we are inside the transaction, we must pass the transaction query or instance to our wallet service that we want to actually query. Then also we must reassign the DB of value on the DB instance on our transaction service, so that by the time we are creating, we will make sure that we are using the transaction service, we are using the query, the transaction, or that is this TX, to actually create our transaction right here. So we are to make sure that, so once we reassign, the DB here will be referencing the actual transaction DB instance. So if we go back, so once we are able to actually create, once we are able to actually create the transaction, we are also able to decrement or increment the budget that is associated to this budget. So if we look at the budget part, you can see that I've added an extra row checking that the category ID supplied is actually not null. So if the category ID supplied is null, we don't want to perform any transaction. Then the same thing, I have done the same thing here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go to our database and I'm going to check our wallets. So now let's look at this wallet. For example, this wallet, let's use the cash wallet that has the round figure. So it has 7,000, it has ID of 7, and it has 500,000 naira saved in it. So we are now going to go to our Postman and we are going to try to actually perform some transaction. So the first transaction I'm going to perform is I'm going to perform an expense transaction. So I'm going to spend, let me say like 3,000 naira on the wallet ID of 7. Let me call it 10, or let me call it 100,000. 1, 2, 3. and I'm going to, let me update the month to, let's say 12, and I'm going to save. Now we've actually spent 100,000 naira, and you'll notice that the wallet balance is also now 400,000. If we come to this side and refresh, so you can see now that because we spent 100,000 naira on that particular wallet, what we have left is what? 400,000. So now let's assume that, oh, this thing was actually a mistake. Oh, I don't want that to be the case. So what we are going to do is we are going to get the transaction ID. Then we can come to our reverse transaction and supply the transaction we actually want to reverse. Then we hit the API. So now our transaction has been reversed. If you check the query, you notice that we selected the transaction, then we insert into the transaction itself. We updated our wallet to a new balance of 500,000. Then we reversed the we recorded the transaction itself. So if we refresh this place now, so you can see that it has been reversed. And if we check our transactions row, you will see that they will have 100,000, which was the one that was expense, then the income, because we actually reversed it. And it's also stated that it was actually a reversal. So now let's assume that we actually wanted to do income. So let's say we want to do income, that is, we want to save money inside one of our wallets. And let me say I want to save, yeah, let's make it 5 million naira. And I want to save it inside the wallet with ID of 6. Now, if we come to our database and check the wallet with ID of 6, you can see that it has 497,000, right? And the ID is 6. So if we record an income, let's say income, so we've saved 5 million naira. So that means by the time we check this, our wallet balance should have increased. So you can see now the million has been added. Now, so that is that. So let's assume, so you can also reverse this particular transaction and say, oh, this is not actually 5 million naira. So you can come here and put in the transaction ID and save. By the time you do that, you come back to your wallet, you can see that the money has actually been removed from the wallet. So that's how we can reverse a transaction that we've already done, so that our wallet can go back to its initial stage. And we are also recording each of those reversals. We are also recording each of those reversals so that we can actually trace. You will notice that on our parent ID as well, we have a parent. So we can see that something that I've noticed now is our parent ID is not actually being saved. So that's something we actually need to look out for. So let's see why the parent ID of the transaction is not being saved. Reverse transaction, parent ID. Okay. Yeah. Transaction, parent ID. Okay. When we save, yeah, so you can see now, you can see what is going on now. We are not associating the parent ID to it at all. And that's why it is not actually being saved. So what we are going to do is, for this, we are going to say that if is reversal, then we want the transaction dot parent ID to be equals to payload dot parent ID, right? We are already setting the reversal as true, right? This reversal. Okay, let's also make sure that the reversal is set to true as well. That is transaction dot is reversal is set to true, like so. I think every other thing has been done right here. Passing it as is reversal. Okay, so we are already doing that. So we can just remove this one. All right. So let's try to refresh our application and try to reverse a transaction. So probably one thing that we need to do is we need to prevent a user from reversing a transaction that is actually a reversal. So let's do that. Let's go to transaction service and no transaction handler, and let's say that if transaction dot is reversal, so let's say if transaction is reversal, we want to return common dot send bad requests and pass in the context. So we can say you can't reverse a transaction of type reversal. All right, so that way, if the transaction is of type reversal, we should not be able to do it. So let's refresh our application and make sure that we are picking that change. So I'm going to try and reverse a transaction that we actually reversed earlier. So let's say you can see this is a reversal 31, right? So let me come to our and say 31. Oh, wait, yeah, 31, ID of 31. Save. So you can see you cannot reverse a transaction of type reversal. So let's reverse a transaction that is not of type reversal. That is, the reverse is not set to true. So the ID of this one, so let's say 17. Now, thinking about it, we also need to make sure that a transaction, so you can see now this has been reversed. We can also make sure that a transaction that has been reversed before should not, because if I do this again, the transaction will be recorded as reversed again. So that means we will now be having a transaction that is being reversed twice, which does not make any sense. So what we are going to do is we are going to come to our handler and we are going to say that so any transaction, so if we check this now, you will notice that since we've added the parent ID now, you can see that we are seeing the parent ID. So with that, we can know if it is actually a reversal. So if you can say if transaction, so we want to know if the transaction has been reversed before. So if there exists a transaction that if the transaction exists in our database, so that means if we look at our database, that means any transaction that has that if there exists a transaction with a parent ID of that transaction, the transaction you want to reverse, if there is already a row in the database that has its parent ID as that transaction, then that means it cannot be reversed. It has already been reversed. So let's see how to actually go about that. Or one thing we can actually do to achieve that is we can make the parent ID column unique, right? We can make it unique, right? We can make it unique. But before we do that, let me quickly do the manual method. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a method to check if there exists. So reversal is okay. Let's say cannot be or what's the best name to actually give this? We can say let's just say reversal exists. So for this, we are expecting the transaction ID, and we want to say that we don't need the joins where the let's say parent underscore ID is equals to the ID. Yes. So anywhere that any transaction that already has somewhere where the parent ID is set to the ID, then that means it has been reversed, right? So what we are just going to do here now is we don't care if it was not found, right? What we can just do is return nil, then error. So okay, let's bring it back. So if it is error record not found, then that means transaction was not found. Then that means there is no transaction with that parent ID set to this. Otherwise, we want to return the transaction. So what we are going to do now is in our handler, we are going to duplicate this. We are going to say transaction reversal exists. And we are going to say reversal. Let me go back to this should be reversal exists. Reversal exists. So if reversal exists, that is if, let's say if reversal is not nil, that is it exists, that particular transaction exists, then we need to send an error. Let's say bad request as well. So we can say this should be you cannot. So the idea is the reversal has already been processed, right? So what we are going to do is let's cut this out. We want to be sure that the transaction exists. We want to be sure that it is not a type of reversal. Then we want to check this as well. We want to check that it is the reversal has not already been done, right? So let's refresh our application. Now, if we try to hit this, we are still getting transaction reversed. So that means there is something. It's not new. So let me check my reversal exists. Let me set the model dot transaction model. So this should be first. Yeah, so where parent ID is this. Okay, let me refresh. So let's hit the endpoint again. So the reason why this is failing is simply because we are still using the query that has been used over here. If we refresh our application and check, let's check again. Hit the endpoint. You can see that the reversal is still going through. So after looking through, I noticed that the query that was built during the process of fetching the transaction here, right? In the process of fetching the transaction here, this query we are reusing it again to check if the transaction is a reversal. So you can see that it's the same query. And if you now check, you can see all these join are still present. Why in our own query here, we are not even using all of that at all. We are not doing that at all. So what we must do is we must build a new query for it. So what this is going to do is let's pass in a user ID of uint, and we are going to now use that scope right here. So let's say scopes dot common where user ID scope, and we are going to pass the user ID right there. So we are going to go back to our, and we are going to remove this. So reversal, we are going to remove this, and we are going to pass the user dot ID. Then we are going to remove this as well. So so that will be ts.db, right? Then let's refresh. So if we hit the API again, so you can see now the reversal has already been processed. So that way we are not reversing a transaction that has already been reversed, and we are not reversing a reversal kind of transaction. So that will be the end of this session. I hope you have been able to pick one or two things from this session, and I hope to see you in the next session.